looking at this text, and all the author was doing was quoting from the Shulchan Aruch, but the language of the Shulchan Aruch itself is somewhat ambiguous. But what the author did was take the language of the Shulchan Aruch and create a hierarchy, which we're going to challenge in just a minute. He said, we learned about a hierarchy of 6 levels before, about the best ways to give tzedakah. The top way is to, I'm saying, but the first one was help a person become self-sustaining. Number 2 was when the giver and the receiver do not know each other's identity, and we went on from there. And then sever panim yafos versus sever panim raos, etc. But here's another hierarchy, and that is which cause takes priority. So he says pidyon shvuyim is number 1, tzedakah likrovim is number. So pidyon shvuyim, we all know, is getting people out of imprisonment or being kidnapped. Tzedakah likrovim is number 2. That's charity to one's relatives. That number 3, hachzaka satorah ocholim aniyim, is supporting Torah study or supporting the sick who are also poor, both sick and poor. Number 4 is building a shul when there's no synagogue in the area, or there are essential needs for the shul, like let's say it needs some vital renovation, or it needs a new AC system, something like that. Hachnasas kala yisoma, doing hachnasas kala for an orphan, making sure she can get married off. That is already number 5. And number 6 is sha'ar aniyim, the rest of the poor, which sounds like a little surprising because he's putting hachzaka satorah as a higher priority than hachnasas kala, and he puts tzedakah for your relatives over hachnasas kala for your soma. So what I want to point out is that this is not so clear when you look at the text inside in the Shulchan Aruch, that this is a clear-cut hierarchy. So what I want to do is we looked briefly at the Shulchan Aruch yesterday, and I want to share with you the Aruch HaShulchan and how he looks at it. See, the Aruch HaShulchan, after he presents the 6 levels of tzedakah as far as quality of giving, then he talks about other Gemaras, because basically what the Shulchan Aruch does is it collects a whole bunch of different Gemaras from different sources, or brises and things like that. And one brisa says there's no tzedakah greater than this. And then another brisa says there's no tzedakah greater than this. So how do you classify it? So the Aruch HaShulchan says, Ulahasi besulos yisomos anios. He says to marry off a yisoma who's poor, to make sure she can find a husband. O bas Talmud Chacham ani, or the daughter of a Talmud Chacham who's poor, to marry them off. Hema mehat stakos hagdolos. They are of the greatest charities. Vilachein, gabait staka kashiyesh biyadam lasos kain. Ein lecha tzedakah gedola mizu l'sameach la'olam nafshot agumot. He says when a gabbai tzedakah has an opportunity to make distributions, and he's got to triage the money carefully to make sure that he only has a limited amount. He says there is no greater tzedakah than this, to give joy to pained souls. Souls that have been downtrodden and in pain. So you look at that quote and you say, okay, so that means that marrying off a yisoma is the highest priority. But that's not what we know. We know that that's not the case. We know that pidyon shvuyim is the number 1. And then he quotes the Ramah that says that the minhag to give tzedakah for the dead during Yizkar is a minhag basikin, and that's actually part of that sif in Shulchan Aruch. Then he writes, Kasav Rabbeinu Beis Yosef B'sof Siman Zeh, Yesh Mi Sha'omer Shemitzvahs Beis HaKnesses Adifa Mitzvahs Tzedakah. Some say that the mitzvah of building a shul is bigger than the mitzvah of tzedakah to give to the poor. Umitzvahs tzedakah lina'arim lilmod Torah ulecholam aniyim adif mitzvahs beis hakneses. And the mitzvah to provide for young men to study Torah or for poor people who are sick is bigger than the mitzvah of Beis HaKnesses. So now you're already starting to see a hierarchy, but it's like a mishmash of all different things. You just got through saying there's nothing greater than marrying off a yesoma. Now we're getting into a different hierarchy. There's the giving tzedakah to the poor. Higher than that is building a shul. And then the Beis Yosef says, and higher than that is giving money to guys so that they can learn, and to poor people who are sick. Umidivrei Rabbeinu balei hatosus b'bava basra bevor that tzedakah gedola mi beis hakneses. He says, but the balei hatosus say no, that tzedakah always trumps the needs of a beis hakneses. Shekasu ve'afal gav dahaikra gabi beis Elokeinu ksiv dahainu bedek habayis kol shekain tzedakah ad kan l'shonam. In other words, the Gemara quotes a pasuk of having to support the house of God, but Tosfos says, but it's even more so for the poor. V'im tzedakah adif mi bedek habayis kol shekain mi beis hakneses. And the Aruch HaShulchan correctly states that if giving money for tzedakah takes priority over the bedek habayis, over supporting the Beis Hamikdash and helping fix the Beis Hamikdash, it certainly takes priority over building a shul. Ulavad mizeh divrei Rabbeinu haBeis Yosef timuhim. He says, and furthermore, the words of the Beis Yosef are quite bizarre. The makor hadin hu meYerushalmi shilhi peya, the havi mitayelin bekinishta delud, va'amru kama nafo shaku bevinyan zeh, demi lo hava bani b'nei nasha diyaluun be'oraisa, bekoru alayhu v'yitosh Yisrael osaihu, the Yiven Hechalos. He says, it talks about some sages who were walking in the synagogue in Lod. And he says, look how many souls were sunk into this building, the Vinyan Zeh. He says, and look how many people could have learned Torah instead of building this Beis HaKnesses. In other words, that's the argument, is that we could have used the money that were used to build this shul, we could have used it to support Torah study. And they recited the verse that says that Israel has forsaken its maker, and they instead built palaces. He says, and there's another girsa in that Gemara, which is the source for sort of like the statement of Beis Yosef that supporting Torah study or the sick who are poor takes priority over building a Beis HaKnesses, because it says in that Gemara over there, look how many people we could have supported to study Torah or to support the sick who are in bed. Umizeh vaday muchach the mitzvahs Talmud Torah the ripoy cholim harbe gadol mi Beis HaKnesses. So you see from here that healing the sick and supporting Torah study takes priority over a Beis HaKnesses. V'Rabbeinu haBeis Yosef hevi mi maharik the dayik mizeh the ilulei Talmud Torah v'ripoy cholim haya Beis HaKnesses gadol mi mitzvahs tzedakah. And the maharik, the Beis Yosef quotes from the maharik, that if it were not for the high standard of mitzvah of Talmud Torah and healing the sick, building a Beis HaKnesses would be higher than tzedakah. But what's the reason for that? V'taimim nira dim lokein habalei lomar milo hava aniyim l'tzedakah. Habal eze diaku zeh di haYerushalmi naken hamitzvos hayoser gedolos. He says, but it's difficult to understand the diak. He says, what's the diak that's made from that Gemara? In other words, the argument is, why weren't these rabbis who were walking through the synagogue of Lod, why didn't they say, oh, instead of building this palace, we could have given so much money for the poor? They didn't say that. They said we could have given so much money to support Torah study and to heal the sick. So you see from here that building a shul is higher than supporting the poor. And the only thing that's higher than building a shul is supporting Torah study and healing the sick. So that's the whole basis for this hierarchy we're discussing now. But the Aruch HaShulchan has a problem with this. He says, "Amnam b'Yerushalmi mavur sham dahavakama be'knishta sha'omer dahu metaylin be'ilain knishta delod ayin sham." He says, but that's not. You have to put everything in perspective. The Gemara over there was saying that the city of Lod at one time was a very wealthy city, and there were a number of synagogues in the city. In other words, by the way, Lod should go back to its original stature. Lod is a relatively economically depressed city, but it's making a comeback. He says the criticism of the Gemara over there was not because it was such a mitzvah to build a Beis HaKnesses, but rather is that there were multiple shuls in the city of Lod, and that was their criticism. Like, that guy's got a shtibel in his backyard, and that guy's got a shtibel in his backyard. If they would have consolidated and joined forces and instead spent that money on Talmud Torah and healing the sick, look at how many lives we could have saved. Ulefiza ein raya klal. He says that was what they were unhappy about. Why are there so many shuls with that guy's name and that guy's name? Base this and base that. And not only that, but their criticism, it sounds like from the Gemara, was that they were oiskapach pachkid. In other words, they were all dressed up, these shuls, with the fancy furniture and all of this other stuff. And that's what they were looking at in a critical eye. They were basically saying, look how much money was put into that chandelier, right? If they would have gotten a basic lamp instead of a chandelier, we could have done so much. That's right. Amru v'lo al etzem binyan beis HaKnesses. Ach b'maharik ra'isi shehevi agirsa v'chazi l'rav tara devei knishda dekabani ayin sham. Im kain lafi girsaso hayarak beis HaKnesses echad. He says, according to the Maharik's girsa, maybe there was only one shul, and so that's the reason for the Beis Yosef's deal. But even if there was only one Beis HaKnesses, it could be their criticism was the fact that it was still so ostentatious and filled with so many luxurious, accessories. Ulavad kol zeh halo b'maharik mavur sham delo koi klal aletzem beis HaKnesses. But if you look carefully at the Maharik, his issue is not the mitzvah of building a shul. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the donations that were given for the shul. How many candles do you need? He says, let's say there's a surplus of people who have given an adava to the oil in the shul. You can use some of that surplus to support the poor. Even though the mitzvah of building a shul is greater than the mitzvah of tzedakah, he says that's in the whole context. The Marik is basically just saying that even though there's a greater mitzvah to build a shul than to support the poor, if a person donated money to build a shul and you have surplus and you can use that to support the poor, that's what you should do. Right. That's right. That was the chiddush. Ulefize enamuvan klal dema inyan hayushalmi lazeh hayushalmi mari betzem binyan beis haknesses. He says, and if that's the case, that was what the context of the Maharik was discussing. What does this in the world have to do with the story in the Yerushalmi? Ulefize behechrech lomer da Maharik pirush hayushalmi leinin kishute beis haknesses kemo shekasafti v'dima kishutim lamor da v'gam kin kishu lebeis haknesses. The Maharik is basically talking not about building the Beis HaKnesses, but rather donations that go to the beautification of the Beis HaKnesses, like people who donate Shemen Lamaor, people who donate oil for the chandeliers in the Beis HaKnesses. You are supposed to make it look beautiful, but the question is, who decides what's considered too much, and what if there are other needs? Ulefizeh Gam kavanas Rabbeinu Beis Yosef hu al nitvos litzorchei Beis HaKnesses below bevinyan Beis HaKnesses atzma. And therefore, when we say that supporting Torah study and supporting and healing the sick takes priority over a Beis HaKnesses, that's referring to donations to upkeep the Beis HaKnesses, and not the building of a Beis HaKnesses. V'zehu vadai the behechreichiyus l'tzorchei Beis HaKnesses vadei dechiyav gomerhu. He says, but because it's clear that you cannot say that supporting Torah study is greater than the building of a shul. He says, because building a shul is necessary for every community. He says, Ela le'inyan mosaros desagi b'lav hachi k'mo riboy neres v'chayotze bazeh. He says, the only issue is that if there are sort of things that are not essentials that the Beis HaKnesses wishes to acquire, such as more candles, more chandeliers, and things like that, that's where we say that it takes a lower level of priority. V'chein muchach b'maharik v'chein b'Yerushalmi dalach rechios v'adei lo hayu mefakbekin. V'chein nira liborer d'zeh shekasvu d'adifa mitzdaka omari b'tzdaka lahachil re'evim. He says, and furthermore, I'm going to go even further. He says, when we say that building a Beis HaKnesses takes priority over tzedakah for the poor, that's not referring to giving food to people who are hungry. He says, he says it's talking only about, in the same context as improving a Beis HaKnesses, improving the quality of life of the poor. In other words, this whole Gemara and this whole prioritization is talking about where the basic essentials have already been met, and you want to know, now that I have extra money and everyone's been taken care of, what should my priorities be? So if the poor have already been taken care of, but you can give them a trip to Niagara Falls to make their life a little bit better. Like I just saw, there's a tzedakah. It's a very nice idea. There's this new tzedakah organization. And as a matter of fact, the reason I know about it is because one of our members just took advantage of it. There's a tzedakah that says that for people who can't afford to take vacations because they're just squeaking by and they have kids in the house and there's a lot of stress, this tzedakah helps people take a vacation. It's a very nice thing. Now, right, so now the question, so then you would ask yourself a question. In that kind of situation, there's a family that would like to take a vacation. Between the family that doesn't have food and the family that wants to take a vacation, hands down, you feed the family that doesn't have food. Now we have additional opportunity for tzedakah. Baruch Hashem, we're a wealthy community. We now have a choice between giving this family a vacation, or I'm speaking with my wife. We can either donate to this family to take a vacation, or we can donate something to the shul. The shul needs to fix the chandelier, okay, in the Perlis Hall, okay. So those are the two options. So neither of those are necessities, right? And one could argue that really the only way the shul can increase its revenue is if it fixes the chandelier in the Perlis Hall, but it's, again, not an essential. So we would say that Binyan Beis HaKnesses takes priority over Aniyim. Yeah. Right. So that's why he says the next higher level. So he says, "V'lachein harchavas Beis HaKnesses adifa." Daiki lamidi hiskiru b'Yerushalmi ha'inyanim ha'yoter gedolim michlal deshari inyanim mitzvahs Beis HaKnesses gedola mehen. He says because the only thing bigger than helping the Beis HaKnesses is to help people learn Torah and to help cure the sick. Uvetosus nearly kavan acheres b'shenedaktek deichach shalom or ditztaka adi from the beta kabayis. He says, and Tosfos's point is also problematic. Tosfos says that tzedakah always trumps building a Beis HaKnesses because habenechemia sham mufurish l'lechem ha'mareches u'minchas hatamid u'la'olas hatamid ve'echef shalomer demutav litein tzedakah milahakriv tamidim v'lechem ha'panim b'Beis HaMikdash. He says the pasuk in Nehemiah that's quoted over there is talking about people donating money for the showbread and for the karbanos. How can you say that you should let the Beis Hamikdash go without those essentials and give money to the poor instead? Ela dahatos v'sachi kamri de'im ba'avodas Beis Hamikdash shayach l'klal Yisrael de'lechora berpruta l'chol echad miYisrael yisasef mamon harbe b'im kol zei tzrich litain shli shekel kol shkein staka shi b'chol makom u'makom v'ani merub nitzrach shlish shekel l'chol hapachas. He says, and so therefore, it's got a whole different interpretation in that Tosfos, where Tosfos basically says, if we can add an additional third of a shekel in order to raise needed revenue for the Beis HaKnesses, we can certainly do the same for charity as well. So bottom line is that the Aruch HaShulchan, does not at all agree that there is a prioritization in the way that this list that we're studying in the text. So what basically this author has done, in the opinion of the Aruch HaShulchan, he's done it incorrectly, is that he's taken all of these different statements in the Shulchan Aruch, put them all together and created a list. Unfortunately, that's not correct. In other words, we cannot say with absolute certainty that if you have two options to either heal the sick or to provide a gift to the Beis HaKnesses, that healing the sick always takes priority. What happens if the shul is going to shut down if we don't fix it? And then someone says, oh, but I know of a person who's got, forbid, going through cancer treatment, and it's a very rare treatment, and they need additional funds, so we have to give it to them. So he says, well, the response is, no, it's not always going to be that one trumps the other. You have to look at each case individually and decide how you want to divide your money, because sometimes it's not a very simple hierarchy in the way that it's being presented. So we're going to respectfully disagree with this list that the author has provided over here here, let me just, we're going to respectfully disagree with this list. This hierarchy is not as etched in stone as the author wishes to suggest. Okay. Klalim b'ha'adafas, right? So let's just be aware. Pidyon shvuyim, it would seem, takes priority over everything because a person's life is at stake. But as far as the other priorities, I don't think that this list is accurate at all. Okay. Next, klalim b'ha'adafas mitzvah. He says that now the rules as far as which mitzvahs take priority over others. Kol makom sheksuv bo adifus mitzvah al mitzvah acheres zedavka kishitzar chayim shavim. He says, whenever we say that one cause trumps another cause, one mitzvah trumps another as far as how you should expend your finances, and we say, okay, this is more important than this, there's no greater joy than bringing a yasoma to the chuppah, right? For example, he says, and so therefore you could say that that's a greater priority than building a Beis HaKnesses, so it's a greater priority than giving standard charity. He says that's only when the needs are equal. In other words, she needs $1,000 for the chuppah, and he needs $1,000 for his operation or for it to cover his mortgage or whatever it is. Okay, so then you can say apples to apples, which one takes priority over which. So for example, what happens if you have a mitzvah that is time critical? In other words, there's something that needs to be taken care of right away for this one particular individual. And if we don't get him this particular medical essential need, he may die. Whereas there's another mitzvah, which is not as time critical. If we don't marry her off this month, we'll marry her off next month. She'll just have to wait. So then you cannot say that marrying off the yasoma takes priority over taking care of a person who needs medical expenses. He says, because, right, it's a question of which one is, in other words, all he's basically saying is that when you want to calculate triage for tzedakah, you can't just say, oh, let me look at the list. All right. And we, by the way, we said the list is not accurate anyway. But he says, even if my list is accurate, you can't just say, look at the list, because there are other factors. Another factor is going to be how time critical, how time urgent is it? Lidugma, chatan v'kala, hanizkakim lidvarim hechrechiyim mamash, kodmim b'matan hatzdaka liyeshiva sheyesh la ruchush v'hashkaot. He says, for example, marrying off a chassan and kala who have essential needs that need to be paid for in order for them to get married would take a priority over tzedakah for a yeshiva that has expenses. Ve'im hatzorech lemitzvah hirak yoter gadol, as beheteim nitan lahakdim chelak yoter gadol mehatzdakot la'otam mitzvah v'hashar lemitzvah hashniya. He says, if it could be that there's a greater need for immediacy for the chassan and kala than for the yeshiva. Gamim mitzvah hashniya adifa b'malata. Even if the second mitzvah, the mitzvah of supporting the yeshiva, takes priority in our list. Ulam lefi chelek mehaposkim yotzim min haklal heim hakrovim shem kodem b'chol tzarcheihem afilu kishiyesh aniyim shenizkakim yoter mehem kamo sheitba'er lahalan. He says the only exception that we'll say is that according to many poskim, the needs of your relatives will take priority over other poor people, even when the needs of those other poor people are more pressing and time critical than the needs of your relatives. So again, you got a big mishmash of prioritization. It's very, very difficult to untangle how to make this calculation in real life. The benefit of learning this, going through this exercise, is to recognize that there are many factors to take into account when deciding how to spend your limited tzedakah money. Right? Don't just be drawn in by the fact that this tzedakah has this really, really slick ad campaign, and they're going to do matching funds, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that. Right? Think intelligently about, look, I have a limited amount of tzedakah, and I know that I need to help support this particular son of mine who is going through a difficult situation. And if I give to this really slick campaign where there's a lot of peer pressure for me to give, I'm not going to be able to support my son in this difficult time that he's going through. So is it worth it? Is it really worth it for me to participate on the level that I'm being pressured to participate?
Seems like he's trying to say a principled approach. Two principles so far: necessity and urgency. Except with your Kara.
Right, except when you have a relative. Yeah, right. And these are guidelines to take into account when you're making your. Yeah. Right. And the truth is he's not presenting it in the most organized way. But I think there's a reason for that. The Shulchan Aruch also did not present it in a very organized way. And the reason for that is that these are matters of, there are certain things that speak to some people more than they speak to others. So we can't really give you a formal hierarchical structure. That's true. Although when it comes to matters of giving your miser money, it is your business, right? And ultimately, you do. Well, yeah, we're giving you a hierarchy, but at the same time, we're saying, but there are exceptions to the hierarchy. Relatives, pressing needs take priority sometimes, right? And so, but just, so you're right. Don't always listen to what pulls at your heartstrings. Like I've said in the past, any tzedakah that has a bald child on the cover of its brochure is always going to make more money, right? Because it's a much right. It's a much easier sell, right?
Said that you criticized, Lubavitch. Don't put 100 million plus into that Lubavitch campus chart. Now it's empty.
Right.
Imagine how much tzedakah could have been for other things.
Exactly. Right. I don't think it's empty. I think they do rent it out.
Full,
But
but
not
not
with the
fully
kids.
though.
No,
No, so other schools are, the Obekas and other places are in there,
Still.
but again, it comes to the thing of like, how do you tell this person, we'll give 100 million here. We have 4 other causes that are way more.
Right.
than this.
And not only that, but okay, we're gonna have to hold it here. Not only that.